Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Capizzi. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. The IHE is the nation's leading academic institute devoted to the scientific study of human flourishing in the light of Catholic social doctrine. Today, we're pleased to welcome you to the second of our three sessions that are dedicated to thinking about the university under some contemporary pressures, in particular, of course, the pandemic, but there are other pressures that we may discuss as well that are sort of placing themselves as impediments to universities trying to do what universities are designed to do. We're joined today by an excellent panel. All three of these panelists are IHE Fellows, and we're really pleased to have them working with us. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then once I've done introducing them, I will turn to the questions that I'll ask the panelists, and then we'll do some Q&A from you, the audience members. Our first panelist is Tom Hibbs. Tom Hibbs is a professor of philosophy and was recently the president of the University of Dallas. Prior to that, Dr. Hibbs was dean of the Honors College and distinguished professor of ethics and culture at Baylor University. He has written, edited, or provided introductions for 12 books, including 3 on the thought of Thomas Aquinas. He received his BA in English and an MA in philosophy from the University of Dallas, and both a master's and a doctorate in medieval studies from the University of Notre Dame. Angela Knoble is our second guest. She's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Dallas and was previously a philosophy professor at Catholic University. She has published extensively on medieval and contemporary ethics. Her work focuses primarily on Aquinas' theory of infused virtue, virtue ethics, and applied ethics. Her book, Aquinas and the Infused Moral Virtues, is forthcoming from the University of Notre Dame Press. She received her BA from the Catholic University of America, and her MA in mathematics from the University of Maryland, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Our third guest is Brandon Vaidyanathan. Brandon is an associate professor of sociology and chair of the sociology department of the Catholic University of America. His research examines the cultural dimensions of religious, commercial, medical, and scientific institutions. He is the author of Mercenaries and Missionaries, Capitalism and Catholicism in the Global South from Cornell University Press, and co-author of Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion from Oxford University Press. He received his BA and MA in Business Administration from St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia and HEC Montreal, respectively, and his PhD in Sociology from the University of Notre Dame. So welcome all three of you. It's a pleasure to have you guys with us this afternoon. Again, audience members, please feel free to submit any questions for the panelists and us anytime. We will turn to Q&A around 2:40, and we really do welcome your questions. All right, so last time, the last group of panelists and I spent some time talking about what universities do, where universities come from. We talked about the historical origins of them and sort of how those origins relate to where universities are today. Being good Thomists, right, we want to talk a little bit about the end of the university, the goals of universities. What are those goals? And in particular, how thinking about the goals of the university or the goal of a university may be impacted by recent events. And of course, the pandemic is the most significant recent event, but there have been lots of pressures on colleges and universities in the United States and elsewhere for some time. And the pandemic may even have just accelerated some of those issues. So the question I want to begin our conversation with is essentially, what is the university's goal, or what are its goals? And Tom, I'm going to start with you there. And how, if at all, have these pressures on contemporary colleges and universities impacted the capability of universities to fulfill those goals?
So, Joe, thank you. It's great to be with you and to be with Brandon and Angela. Really grateful for all the work you do at the Institute, and remain grateful for the sabbatical you afforded me a few years ago, which the book is coming out soon. So really grateful for all that, and just love the work and all the events that you put on. So yeah, for an opening 2-minute answer to a question that would probably take 3 hours adequately to respond to, let me say just a couple things. So you had a quote from Newman in the advertisement for this event. And I think Newman is obviously very important and very interesting, but he's also little understood because he has really complicated things to say if you read the whole of Idea of a University, if you read other things. So I think the basic idea, which I take from Newman about the goal of any university, Catholic or not, is that it's about, to put it simply, it's about the pursuit of truth in its complexity and its unity. Right. And it's important that it's not just about the pursuit of truth, but it's about complexity and unity. Because I think we often tend in our own habits and in our teaching and in our institutions to toward complexity that veers away from the possibility of unity, and sometimes toward a precipitous unity that neglects the complexity of knowledge. So I think we could spend a lot of time just talking about that. But if you take up other works, Newman's historical sketches, for example, or if you take up this really interesting sermon that he gave on the Feast of St. Monica to launch the academic year, where he was rector of University College Dublin, there he says that the goal of a Catholic university is to reunite things originally held together by God, but rent asunder by man. That's a much bigger project than simply, and it's a big project simply to pursue truth in its complexity and its unity. But there Newman's thinking about the formation of the souls of young people. And there he will sometimes shift to what he calls a collegiate model rather than a university model. So I think that primary goal is under assault by all sorts of instrumental pressures that were around before the pandemic, for jobs, for credentials, that are going to be exacerbated by the economic impact of the pandemic for many families. I think also the pandemic has made it harder for us to sit face to face across from one another in conversation about the most important questions, which I think for Newman was an assumption of the collegiate model, that faculty would actually live among students. Not only do we not live among students today, but in many cases on college campuses today, we're not even in person in class. We've been fortunate at the University of Dallas that 80% of our classes in person. We've been very lucky, but it's made it a lot harder to pursue that model of a communal pursuit of truth face to face in person. Let me stop there.
That's great, Tom. Thank you very much. That's, like you said, that's given us already a lot to pick up on. All right, Angela, you want to maybe pick up on something Tom said, or go in a different direction?
Sure, and thank you again, Joe, for putting this together and bringing us all here. Great experience, great discussion, great panelists. I mean, I really think in my 2 minutes, much of what I had prepared affirms what Tom just said, maybe from a little different perspective. I'm always hesitant to talk about Newman because Newman wrote so much, and as Tom just rightly indicated. But I mean, when I think about the purpose of the university, I think about what Aristotle says in the very first sentence of the Metaphysics, that all nature desire to know. We have, as human beings, a unique capacity for wonder. We want to make sense of the world and our place in it. And that's what makes us human. That's what sets us apart from other things. And if we just try to subsist and get by and pay our mortgages, there's gonna be something missing. We're gonna want something more. And as I see it, the purpose of a university education is to prepare us for the fullness of human life, right? It initiates us into the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. And in doing so, it helps us actualize what is highest and best in us. And when we encounter, as Tom said, the complexity and the unity of the pursuit of truth, we give weight and depth and meaning to our lives. So I first just want to affirm what Tom was saying. And I think to turn in my second minute to the other half of your question, I think that the realization that the challenges of COVID gave me, I think it helped me crystallize something that I didn't fully appreciate about the pursuit of knowledge. And what COVID helped me realize is just how communal the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is. We tend to think, university professors, we all know we all have poor social skills and things like that, right? Because we're nerds. But the pursuit of knowledge is an inherently communal activity. We can't do it in isolation. We know as human beings in an inherently human way, right? We've got to engage in that pursuit with other people. And I think, when you talk to other professors about what was most difficult about COVID, it's that we couldn't be in person. Last March, we at least had the benefit, we didn't know how to use Zoom, but we at least had the benefit of having been able to get to know our students first in person and to have those relationships. And that for me was really eye-opening, just that, of course, you know it in some sense, but you also don't know it, that the university is a community and the pursuit of truth occurs as a community. So I'll stop there and we can, I'm sure, return to some of these things as we go along.
Great. Thank you very much, Angela. Okay, Brandon, 150 seconds.
Ditto. There, done.
There you go.
I completely agree. I mean, I don't have much to add in terms of the definition of the purpose of university, and so I mean, I completely agree that it is about the communal pursuit of truth, and it needs to be driven by wonder, and it has to be a place where we cultivate wonder and where learning happens in community. If I could speak for a couple minutes longer, I would like to share some of the things that students have told me. Since I'm an empirical social scientist, my first instinct when I was asked to be on this panel was to ask students what they thought of this topic. And so I got some interesting responses from a variety of students from very different disciplinary backgrounds and so on. Their views on the purpose of the university differed quite a bit from those who saw it as being primarily in the business of cultivating our orientation towards the truth, to people who thought this was primarily, a university is primarily a networking hub, a place where you connect with other people who can help you get jobs. But regardless of what they thought the university was about, when I asked them what they gained and lost in the pandemic, and in what sense the pandemic either enabled or inhibited the goal of the university, I got very similar answers. So when they talked about gains, many of them would say, I had more free time to read. I was able to access class recordings and go back over the content. We had guest speakers from different cities, countries, et cetera, over Zoom that wouldn't have been possible before. So if the purpose of the university is just learning content, like downloading course materials into your head, then the new normal brought about by the pandemic actually serves that well. But everyone thought that more had been lost than gained. And then again, regardless of how they articulated the goal. And let me give you a couple of the main themes that came across. I'll give you some quotations. So here's one student saying, it is one thing to go to class and learn something and then leave. It is something else to go to class, learn about something, leave, and continue to engage with the material through discussion with your peers. One of my favorite parts about living on campus and being friends with people who are in so many different majors is learning through them what they learn in their classes. Another student said, at night I would usually head over to the Priz to eat and see whatever activity or club was going on or explore on our days off and long weekends. And now it feels like CUA has become all work and no play. Another student says, a mere exchange of course credit for hours behind a laptop while a professor shares the PowerPoint on Zoom. This is not education. Education begins and ends in conversation. Another student said, attending CUA classes online is not attending university. It's just CUA classes online. So there's a distinction they're making, right? So on the one hand, they've spent more time reading and studying than they did before. On the other hand, they're like, there's more to learning than just being in the class and downloading content in your head. And they complained about burnout and a loss of motivation. And the other thing everyone lamented was a loss of a sense of community and belonging. So here's another student saying, we've lost the feeling of camaraderie among classmates. I feel like the social norms within the classroom have changed. Even when we're back in person, I feel we're still not getting to know one another. It's tough to pick up on social cues with masks on, and talking to my friends, the general consensus is most people feel uncomfortable. Another one said, it's become harder to have conversations beyond the classroom. It feels unnatural. Even when I see people from my classes who I've spoken to individually in Zoom breakout rooms, it's awkward. I'm never sure if I should say hi or just smile or do nothing at all. Right? So there's something about the nature of how we learn, how we relate to one another that has been disrupted. I can come back to more about this, but I want to just stop there and to say that I think what they've identified is there's something really crucial about community and learning in community that is central to the business of what we do here.
Great, thanks. Thanks to all three of you. There's a ton on the table, but before we proceed into some of maybe like the meatier kinds of questions, I want you all I want to like get some clarity on something. You all affirmed some role for learning for its own sake as key to what a university does or is. And I think that's the kind of language that academics are very comfortable saying, right? You know, you're learning for your own sake, but I imagine at least some of our audience, and maybe if we think about it a little bit, might wonder, what exactly does that mean, right? To learn for its own sake, because even when you start to think about it, right? Okay, learning for its own sake. Well, because that'll help me understand something. Right? You immediately start to think of some kinds of even more abstract uses to which one might put it. So, Angela, I'm going to just put you on the spot first. What do we mean when we academics all say and affirm, yes, you're learning for its own, we're learning for its own sake. Can you give me a little bit more on that?
Sure. It's funny. This was driven home. This is totally accidental, but we're just starting the Nicomachean Ethics in my freshman philosophy class. And, Aristotle talks about happiness and how it's pursued for its own sake. And he talks about the different kinds of lives that people consider to be the pursuit of happiness. And, the pleasure, wealth, honor, virtue, study, and so, just teaching in class, I put those up on the board and I asked my students, I said, like, okay, so which ones can we just cross off? Like, which clearly have to be wrong, right? And this is the beautiful thing about freshman philosophy, right? A non-zero number of the students said, well, you can cross off study, right? I mean, that's clearly not anything that anybody would ever do for its own sake. You only do that for other stuff, I'm not dumping on my students because I remember as a freshman having that exact same thought, right? Like, and I liked school, but it's only good for other stuff. And I think one of the realizations that is so beautiful about the university is coming to realize that you're hungry for something you did not even know you were hungry for, because the learning can be a reward in itself. You have the experience of something being awakened in you. And it doesn't matter whether it happens in math class or whether it happens in philosophy class or history class, where you see something differently. And it's difficult to describe what happens in you when you have this experience of just delighting in the knowledge of something. But it's almost, for me, this is almost going to be prosaic, but I remember being an undergraduate, it feels like something in you you're being fed, right? You're getting nourishment for the very first time. And it's rewarding in and of itself, not because it's going to get you a job, not because this, that, or the other thing, but because it's fulfilling to you as a human being to gain knowledge. So that's my very prosaic answer.
Great, that's very good, thank you. Tom or Brandon, if you guys want to jump in on that same question, please feel free to. Otherwise, I was going to move to some questions about community because that also came up. So not seeing anything. So let's talk about community. And Brandon, maybe I'll start with you on this question. So community came up in all three of your answers as well, right? That the university really is trying to be a community of truth-seeking men and women, right, in its complexity and in its unity. And COVID in particular has been an obstacle to forming the kind of community perhaps that, in which that can thrive. It sounds like at least some of your students are saying. But there are other pressures even before that, before COVID, right, on forming this kind of community, universities being this kind of community. And I guess like the bluntest way to put my question is, given the responses all three of you gave, are there actually universities in the United States of America? And I don't want us to name any, obviously. I don't want to say, oh yeah, let's champion this place or not, but is it just an aspirational goal, like an ideal that, we're all striving towards? Or can you actually create these kinds of communities given all of the pressures that we all are aware of? And again, COVID obviously presents new kinds of pressures, but can we form communities like this? Are there communities like this at, at universities, Brandon? Or is it just an ideal?
I mean, from what I heard from our students here, for many of them, and granted, this is not a representative sample, right? I mean, so
Sure.
this is
You're
just,
disavowing your science?
don't ask me for a p-value or anything. I mean, but these are students, who seem to say that we used to have a sense of community here that is now been somehow dismantled by the pandemic, right? So there used to be, and again, it's simple things. It's the possibility of, and people complain like, why do we need to have better dining halls or extracurricular activities, et cetera? What does this have to do with the university? But for these students, I mean, this is where the learning happened. It happened outside the classroom and not just in the classroom. It happened walking across campus, sitting and sharing meals with others, sharing their lives with other people. It happens when you've encountered something beautiful in a text you're reading or in a class you're in, and you're moved by that beauty to share it with someone else, right? And that has to happen somewhere, and it can't happen, it isn't happening on Zoom. So there's something about these, the context that we have here that allows this learning to happen. So going back to your question about the pressures, yeah, sure. I mean, these pressures have been around for a long time. I mean, my own experience is, I started out in computer science like most Indian immigrants to North America. My dad took out a loan so that I could get credentials from a North American university that would give me a high-paying job, and that's it. There was no question about learning for its own sake. Fortunately for me, my university forced me to take a liberal arts course. So I had to take courses in philosophy and theology and psychology and sociology, and so that changed my life. But it wasn't just the coursework. It was the conversations with professors and students, hanging out at a professor's place or going out to the pub with a professor or a group of students, sharing life together with people who became new models for me, who changed my sense of what a good or desirable life was, right? And it was a context that sustained wonder. It created wonder and sustained it. So I think those contexts exist. It is possible to cultivate wonder, and I don't know if we can engineer it so that it happens for everyone, but I think if people are moved, and if there are spaces where questions, I mean, I think of Reinhold Niebuhr, who says there's nothing more useless or foolish than the answer to a question that is not asked. So the university shouldn't be in the business of throwing answers at people who have no questions, right? It has to be a place where the questions can emerge, and those questions are cultivated in friendships and in conversations. People are moved by, drawn by the beauty of reality and surprised by it and moved the questions are things that emerge in you and you can't stop thinking about them. They keep you up at night. They animate your conversations with your friends. They make you want to share what you're learning with other people. So I think if we can create a space where that happens, then we're succeeding. And I fear the pandemic has really challenged the ability of that.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. Tom, do you want in on this? Because I know Angela has a comment as well. Tom.
Yeah, sure. Let me make a couple comments. And one is autobiographical, akin to Brandon's. I mean, I grew up not far from where Joe is now in the DC suburbs, and neither one of my parents went to college. I went to DeMatha High School, which was basically a blue collar high school back then. I was neither serious about my faith nor about learning. But when I got to college at the University of Maryland, this huge place where I felt sort of really alienated, having come from a small private school to a big public school, I also found that I was challenged in ways some of my friends weren't by atheist professors that I had. Not people who were trying to destroy my faith. They were just smart people who didn't believe in God. I found this earth-shattering, that there were smart people who didn't believe in God, and it actually caused me to start thinking and take seriously my faith and the academic life. But looking back now, I know that I had teachers in high school who, particularly a couple of English teachers, whose classes I did actually work in. And it was partly because I was terrified of them, because they were also athletic coaches, football coaches. But I could never have articulated this at the time, but they were trying to get me to see that I had a brain and intellect, that I should use it, and that if I used it, I might enjoy it. And I think that after the fact, I discovered that, and I discovered that there were resources I had from my high school time, even though I wasn't a good student, that I could draw upon. But this goes back to Angela's point about this hunger and in the soul, right, for this. The question is how do we awaken in students the sense that that hunger is there, the sense that that need is there? And just two quick thoughts about that. One is that I think we need our best teachers teaching freshmen, like Angela is doing this semester, right? We need our best teachers in there engaging these students at the very beginning, showing them that they have intellects, that we're going to take those intellects seriously, even if they don't, on the hope that they will eventually awaken to the fact that they ought to take their intellect seriously. And if they do, they'll really like it.
Great, thank you. Angela, I know you had a comment.
Yeah, so I think I want to affirm what Tom and Brandon were saying, and I just have this to add. I think that what the pursuit of truth has going for it in the university is human nature. I mean, where I went to the University of Maryland too for my master's degree. I've been at secular universities. I've been at private universities. I was in the math department at Maryland. At every university, I had those great truth-seeking moments, because that's what people are. And when people come together and think about things, the pursuit of truth happens. Now, it can, I completely affirm what Tom was saying. It can happen in better and worse ways, right? And we can kind of form it and shape that pursuit so that it happens better and more frequently and goes more deeply. But I think just human beings being the kind of things that they are, namely beings that wonder and beings that want to know, we want to do the things that a university ought to be doing. I do think that there is a way that can be thwarted. And that's, I mean, if you push the profit model really far, we would all be on Zoom all the time, because you don't need buildings, it's way cheaper. You can try and teach way more people, if you push the profit model so far that community is prevented and minimalized and taken out of the game, then I think we're going to destroy ourselves. And then I think it's no longer going to be possible to do what a university ought to do.
Right, right, very good. And certainly part of perhaps what might have been baked into Brandon's concern was that COVID has introduced certain things towards which we were trending, right? Like online, increasingly online and hybridized education, teaching models. There's still some talk that these things may be with us and so on. And obviously those would be impediments in the way you're saying, Angela, to building these kinds of communities that all three of you think are essential to universities. I'm going to turn our conversation a little bit and to another issue, another pressure that is on universities. And in a sense, we're all talking about the truth, the good of the truth, and so on. And we come out of, the four of us have been educated in Western universities that emerge out of a Western canon, essentially, right? A Western approach to thinking about things. And that itself is under pressure. Right now, the conception of liberal arts, the conception of a Western canonical heritage, right? A heritage of books and so on, and thinkers that one should plow through, is all under pressure. And some of the pressure is, I think we probably all would agree, good pressure. It's pressure to think about expanding the canon, the voices that in the past have been excluded. So, Tom, I'm going to start with you in this question. How can we, on the one hand, deepen students' awareness of that canon that I just described, that kind of classic canon that really informs this Western university model? How about, on the one hand, we inform students about that, increase their awareness, their wonder about it, and also increase their openness to new voices, to challenges to this canon that guards against a kind of merely reflexive dismissal of the canon's expansion, its own fluidity, its own growth, and so on. Get the question?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. So I think first of all that we have to realize that most students come to us without much deep immersion in anything these days. And so it isn't as if, I mean, certainly they've been shaped by Western ideas in the culture and in the political order, but and increasingly high voltage criticisms of those ideas as well. But they haven't typically, unless they out of certain kinds of private schools or charter schools, they haven't really been immersed in any kind of unified tradition of inquiry. And so I think particularly in the Catholic tradition, and the Catholic tradition is of course not just Western, but also Eastern in important ways, we have a responsibility to give students something of an immersion in the roots of our tradition and our traditions. I think it's also important to note that that's a tradition of conflict and disagreement, right? It's not, you can't just say, I affirm the Western tradition of philosophy, right? Because you'll be affirming the principle of non-contradiction, the violation of the principle of non-contradiction, because it is a tradition of debate and inquiry. And one of the things you realize is that it extends beyond itself. I mean, you can look at the way someone like authors like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison are in deep conversation with Dostoevsky, both by way of critique and by way of borrowing. And there too, there's an extension that's also involves critique. I don't see that as something that goes in it as if we have this unified canon and then there are these other things outside. It seems to me that's a false picture that both critics and defenders sometimes rely upon. Now, I wouldn't want to make it so malleable that we can't make any distinctions, but it's a tradition of debate. And I think to show the way in which it opens up into other things, and then to show the way there are, Fides et Ratio begins by talking about in every culture, in every civilization, there is this impulse toward wisdom, toward the pursuit of wisdom. And one can see analogous, not univocal, but analogous workings out of the pursuit of wisdom, the best way of living, the best way of understanding our place in the cosmos in relation to others and in relation to God. I think that there are ways to do this, and it's important that that students see that there are ways to do this. It's also important that I think sometimes when you read Plato with freshmen now, that they consider that alien and foreign, right? It's not as if they pick it up and say, "Oh, this is my stuff." Right? This is my guy. They feel alienated by various forces in the culture that we've already been discussing that make liberal education itself difficult. And they're likely to be often as alienated by things they see from other cultures as from older parts of Western culture. So I think that's just a beginning to kind of say that I think the question's really complicated, but we do want for our students to be willing to engage with anyone, sympathizers and critics of their own views, in a civil way, in a charitable way, not just because it's important for civic life, although it is, but also because we know from the best of our tradition, say Thomas Aquinas, that the more we know, the more we're aware, more confident about what we believe. But part of the confidence is the realization there are always going to be other objections that come up. And I need to be open to considering those. And I need to be altering my views where the evidence indicates that I ought to alter my views. And this is not an all or nothing question every time an objection comes up, right? And I think beginners often think it is an all or nothing question anytime it's an objection. I love, just to end with this, I love Aquinas's phrasing in the opening of both Summas, where he talks about faith and reason. He says there can be objections that appear to come from philosophy to the faith, but these aren't coming from true philosophy. And because we know that the same God who reveals truth to us also reveals himself in created nature and in reason, it is possible, we believe that it is possible to answer these objections. I love the confidence and the humility of it is possible in Aquinas. He's not even saying I have the answers right now. He's saying we have a confidence, trust, we have a hope because of our faith that we will be able to answer these. But it doesn't mean I'll be able to answer them today or that anyone I know will. It may mean I'll spend a long time wrestling with these questions. But I do so in the hope and the confidence that faith and reason ultimately come together. And at various points in our lives, they become more deeply integrated. Sorry if I've gone on too long there.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. I mean, really, you're quoting Thomas. It's hard to object to that, Tom. So, we're in good shape. Angela, I'm going to turn back to the conversation that I had with the panelists from last time and a kind of operating assumption that the panelists seemed to share. And that was that that one of the goals of universities is character formation of its students. What do you think about that? Because we've talked about more or less like the life of the mind so far, right? Maybe you'd call it intellectual formation, right? Creating a community that pursues the truth together. It would seem like that would implicate certain kinds of virtues and formation, but on the other hand, I think lots of universities don't really take the time to think about forming students. So is it a goal of universities to form their students or not?
Thanks. Joe's asking me about this because he knows that I have kind of cantankerous views about it. Look, of course, character formation is relevant. And of course, university education can form character because anything we do forms our character, right? So I think it would be a mistake to think that we send our children somewhere to get their characters formed, right? I used to ride horses, and there were always really rich people who would like send their horse off to be trained. And they would think that like when it came back, they should win all of these horse shows. And they would for like one show. And then the horse would go back to being their horse, right? So this is why I get kind of aggravated when I hear too much that college is about making people virtuous, not because I don't think that it has implications for virtue, but because I think that when we emphasize that side too much, that good consequence, we can take our sights away from what college is really about, which is harder to defend, right? I mean, I think any parent would give you all their money if you convinced them that you were going to make their child a good person who went to church on Sunday and didn't live in their basement, right? I think that's an easy sell. I'm going to awaken a thirst for knowledge in your child is a little bit harder sell, and yet it seems like that's more important, right? And so I think we ought to be in the business of defending that. Now, I want to say, lest I go on too long, I want to say if that's the goal, if the goal is pursuing knowledge for its own sake, of course it matters where we send our child to learn to pursue knowledge for its own sake, right? I have a little 3-year-old who is just taking soccer lessons, right? So this is why I've been thinking about it, right? If I send my child to learn soccer, of course it matters who I send her to learn soccer from, right? I'm not going to send her to a soccer teacher who teaches her that soccer is the only thing that matters, or that winning is the only thing that matters, or etc. Right? So, of course, I care about her character and how her character is going to be formed in that pursuit, but I'm still sending her to learn how to play soccer, right? And so, I guess that's my analogy for the university. You're still going, right, to have your sense of wonder awakened and to pursue knowledge for its own sake. Of course, we ought to be sending our children to a place and to learn from people who are going to have a proper conception of how the pursuit of knowledge fits into a life, right? And who put forward good models of what the pursuit of truth looks like, and who don't try and crush their souls or so on and so forth. But I still think it's important to hold on to the idea that the university is fundamentally about the pursuit of knowledge, and it can have incredibly important consequences for the formation of character and everything else. But I would still say it's most fundamentally about the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, no, okay, so, and right, what distinguishes it from other things is precisely that, right? I mean, this is its reason for being, right? Is precisely that pursuit. So, but part of what I hear you saying, and I think was even implied, and I'm going to turn to you, Brandon, with what eventually will be a question, is that the university is itself embedded in a community or communities, right? It's not merely trying to form a community, you know, an abstraction. So in a way, it's dependent upon the young men and the young women who enter it every year, you know, how they are formed and where they're going to and so on. And we're going to get questions that are quite practically oriented. And some of them are going to be along the lines of this, which is something like, Brandon, your father was right. You know, he sent you thinking, my son, in order for him to be somewhat successful and happy, needs to acquire education. I mean, we can call it credentialing, but it's not, you know, I mean, that can be just like sort of question begging, right? But he needs to acquire education to advance, because there's all kinds of markers that suggest if you are excluded from this community within a community, from university, you will suffer. And Brandon, you probably saw there was there's a study that's just come out about the relationship of mortality rates to possession of a BA that essentially are saying that those who have BAs will live longer than those who don't in America, and that gap is growing. How are we supposed to make sense of that kind of these kinds of practical questions of, you know, communities and so on within communities? Brandon, for you.
Yeah, that's a much more challenging question. I mean, this deaths of despair phenomenon is, I think we're still trying to grapple with this, and this has been, again, before the pandemic too. It's been going on for a while. And there's a lot here. I think that the sort of loss of community in America. There's a long story, like, you know, social scientists going back to the early 2000s, like Putnam, talking about the erosion of community, erosion of various forms of community from whatever, bowling clubs or to faith, you know, religious institutions, right? You see among those without a BA are less likely to be religious and so forth. So you do find some important differences in what the social fabric of America looks like, particularly, and it's different by, I mean, there are all other kinds of complexities. This is predominantly a white phenomenon. It's not, you know, it's not quite the same in other racial communities and so on. So, I mean, I think part of what's hard to tease apart in these statistics is that, you know, there is also this the sense that people who are, you know, part of this group that is dying of despair feels excluded from the elites of America, right? That the East Coast, that's even politically, I think that you can see that even the Democratic Party has alienated working class whites and so forth. So you can see so much that is driven by that phenomenon, that we don't belong to this America that has the BAs, and most of them are, have secure jobs, and they have a sense of a future that is inaccessible to us. So there's a lot more there. I think it's hard for me to address this very quickly, but
Sure.
I guess sort of in terms of, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let me follow up. So one of our questions, and again, I encourage everybody who's listening to send us some questions, and we've already gotten some really wonderful ones. And I'm gonna pick up on one, Brandon, that really speaks to another angle on this same problem. And this is a professor, colleague of all of ours, who asks, what are some thoughts, Brandon in particular, we'll start with you, on the challenges of proposing an education, in the sense of presenting this to students who grew up without such a basic thing as a home? In other words, who come from shattered family backgrounds and so on, right? I mean, this is another variation on this, that this is a challenge for modern universities and for faculty like us. How do you present an education presupposing all the stuff that we did, this idealized,
surrogate family, right? For many people, I mean, it is
right,
and even a surrogate faith community, and so the kinds of institutions that, if you look at Newman's, you start reading Newman, then you realize, well, who are the students who are coming to the university that he has in mind, and what is their family life like, and their formation like, and what kind of, and I mean, they're very different. These are elites who are coming from stable families, etc., and that is not the typical university student in our country. And so, I mean, we're dealing with a different kind of animal right now in terms of what kind of institution we are, and the conditions for learning, the conditions for cultivating intellectual virtues, you know, I mean, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think this is why universities, I think, have counseling centers, and we have, you know, various, you know, other student, you know, oriented groups that, you know, that student services and so forth that are trying to figure out how to create an environment where students can, especially those coming, you know, maybe from very different backgrounds, can actually find a community together, because it isn't easy when you're coming from a lot of different backgrounds to come together around simply intellectual pursuits. That there's a lot more work to be done there. So I mean, this is where I think it is immensely challenging, and we have to pay attention to what student life looks like, and this also, I think, there's an important role for faculty here in terms of how they cultivate relationships with students and how they can, you know, be less transactional in how they communicate with students. And you know, yeah, I mean, there's just so much more I think we need to think about in terms of what the nature of the contemporary university is here, and the needs and the fragility of students who are coming, especially today.
Yeah, great, thank you. Tom or Angela, if you got either of you wants in on that one, feel free to. Otherwise, I'm going to move to another excellent question. It actually picks up quite well, Brandon, on something you just mentioned. And Tom, I'll give it to you in your role as an administrator. One thing we discussed in the last session was how universities, when they're first formed, right, they're filled with faculty, right? And faculty basically function also as administrators, right? There aren't professional administrators. That's a kind of subsequent development. And right now, what's impressing itself on universities, of course, is the growth of administrators themselves. And this person asks, this faculty member asks, can you comment on the changed academic landscape in terms of how it's impacting faculty themselves? So we've talked about how these pressures are bearing on the formation of a community of, you know, truth seeking among faculty and students, but how about just among faculty, you know, as a thing in itself? Because presumably we want to think of them as a community sharing in this truth-seeking endeavor and so on. And it seems like there are increasing obstacles to them feeling like they're members of a community. So Tom, if you could take a swing at that.
Yeah, very good. I think even in smaller colleges, there's a tendency for various administrative units, and even within the administration for various units, and then various other departments, including the faculty, to become siloed and separated from one another. It's not just at the big research universities this happens. It happens at small places, so that athletics becomes siloed or student life becomes siloed. And then the faculty are over here looking at this thing with all these other silos and wondering, where do I fit in to this thing where there are all these other forces governing how my students spend their time, what they're being told is important. You know, I think as an administrator, and I've thought this and tried to do it at the University of Dallas and other places I've been before, the goal is to attempt to break down these silos so that, you know, what Brandon was talking about with student life, you actually need campus ministry, student life, counseling, and some faculty interacting with one another, talking about the whole formation of students. It can't just be that counseling does its thing, campus ministry does its thing, and faculty do their thing. Now, that means you're asking faculty to do other things beyond what they've been trained to do, which is primarily to do research, write, and teach, and to mentor students in the life of the mind and research and so forth. But you do have faculty, and I think some faculty are often attracted to Catholic universities because they're interested in being involved more widely than just in teaching of classes in the academic sphere. So, I mean, I also think that in terms of hiring, especially with administrators, I've always looked for people who, you're looking for the person who has multiple things, right? I mean, that's what we all want. You want someone who's a good researcher, who's a good teacher, and who fits the Catholic identity. I also am always looking for people who might be leaders in some way or another, who could take on some sort of role as a faculty member that would give a faculty voice to the rest of the university. And, you know, when we talk about shared governance, I wonder if going forward, we're not going to have to think about shared governance as not just in terms of very important and indispensable policies, tenure, all of that, but shared governance also in terms of a role for at least a certain portion of faculty in actually helping to build the institution. I think we're gonna have the need for that going forward because of the pressures on the institution. Now, what would be great there is if we weren't simply adding lots of new administrators, but we were adding faculty with academic credentials and experience who are great teachers who could also help build things so that you had a greater academic voice in administration. I've always liked to try and give administrators who work for me the opportunity to teach when they can, if they are academics, so that they stay in touch with students in the classroom. The new president at the University of Dallas, my good friend JJ Sanford, likes to say it's cheaper than therapy for him to teach and get a break from administration. And I think it's important that we break down these silos, and especially that we have faculty where possible after tenure and where they're interested involved in helping to shape things in student life and elsewhere.
If I could quickly add to that, I think that's also
Yeah.
crucial because around the country, the data shows that faculty morale is low, and being part of building an institution can really help with morale, right? So this is part of something you are helping to create, as opposed to just being in a silo where you've got your little function.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Okay, another question. Angela, I'm going to turn this one to you. It's a very practical, faculty-oriented question. So before the questioner writes, before the pandemic, institutions were experimenting with distance learning via online learning. The pandemic, it seems, has helped us evaluate that experiment by forcing all learning to be online. What conclusions do you, Angela, think we can now draw about the nature and limitations of online learning in regard to the purposes of education? So really, like, what's your opinion, Angela, on this? I'm letting my Weimaraner in, by the way. I'm sorry about that.
So I actually, I have a very practical answer based on practical experience. Several years ago, long before any pandemic, I, participated in this experiment to create an online summer class. And it was asynchronous. So it was there were kind of set parameters. It had to be asynchronous so that students didn't have to be in the country or didn't have to all log on at the same time. And there's supposed to be little short pre-recorded lectures. And I worked really hard at it, and I made lots of assignments. And I made all my little videos. And my sense of that course was that it was a complete disaster. And if I'm being perfectly honest, and the reason why it was a disaster is because there was zero personal content, right? I mean, I made them do lots of journals and things like that, but there was none of that conversation, which is so essential to philosophy, especially, but I would think to most classes. There was none of that. There was no human interaction. If it's a cost model, great, right? Because it was self-contained. It could run. You didn't need me after I had made it once, right? Anybody could run it. You could have tons of students. It was terrible. And to my surprise, when we went online last spring, I actually thought that online learning was fairly successful. But here's why. It was synchronous. Everybody was online together. Thanks to Zoom, you can see everybody's faces if your class is small enough. You can make eye contact. You can read expressions. You can stimulate discussion by making little polls. I think that online learning can be relatively successful if the classes are small enough that you can see everybody can see everybody. If you can have those conversations and read facial expressions. I don't think it's ever going to be as successful as meeting in the flesh, but it can be relatively successful. And the degree to which it is successful is the degree to which we can have almost normal human interactions with each other. That's my view about the success of online learning.
Great, thank you. Brandon or Tom, do you want in on that from your own experience or?
I mean, I just would add again, what my students have said is that after a while it just gets too much, right? The burnout sets in, and then they lose motivation, and then that lack of processing a conversation that, for its effects to continue. I mean, that becomes really discouraging. I think, especially if you've tasted something beautiful before, and then now what you have is it's kind of cheap inferior. There is a sense of loss and disillusionment there that's hard to overcome.
Yep. One quick thing on that, Joe. I think the course you had last spring, Angela, you started in person, and then I think it helps if there's been a beginning that's in person. You know, seminars I've been involved with the Lilly Fellows grad program, where you start with conferences where you're in person, then you do a bunch of stuff online, then you get back together. It works better that way. I think this fall, Stacy, my wife Stacy, was teaching a freshman philosophy class that was completely online, and I helped out a good bit. And you could just see what Brandon was describing, the exhaustion, the drain, the lack of energy over time, because the Zoom thing doesn't feed you in the way you need as an 18-year-old, and doesn't give you that sense of belonging that you need to start out. It's much easier if there's been already a shared identity that's formed in person, and then you add on, or you have a period where online is predominant. But just to start out from scratch with that and go the long haul, it's really tough and counterproductive for lots of students. It's just tough.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question. So this question says, suppose you're a faculty member at an institution, even a Catholic one, that does not share the vision we've discussed for higher education. Setting aside broader institutional and curricular proposals, what can individual faculty do to try to enact this vision on their own? In other words, in the classroom, you know, how can they try to enact this on their own? Brandon, you want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what I do. I mean, this is, you know, I mean, of course, the vision here is I think completely congruent with at least we aspire to the same vision here. But the practices that, you know, that I think I find helpful are, and it varies whether you're teaching a freshman class or you know, seniors. You know, with seniors, I really intentionally do try to connect their learning in our courses to what they've learned at the university. So there's a lot of exercises where they have to draw on source material from other classes. The other kind of thing I do is co-teach with folks from other disciplines. So really trying to figure out how to overcome the sort of narrow specialization that I think is, you know, really a plague in the modern university. And then, you know, before the pandemic, I'd invite students over to my home very often. And that, you know, I lament that I can't do that anymore. But that, again, I think is really helpful for them to build community, but also to see, you know, your professor is not just sort of this entity that you see behind a podium or something, but we really build, you know, we could share a life together. So those practices I found helpful. And also maybe the fourth thing is trying to help, and this is a point I think that had come up earlier, but discovering that people have not just a thirst for knowledge, but a capacity to do things, right? So that I can master a difficult text, or I can conduct a difficult experiment. So helping them recognize and celebrate little victories as such. And so my freshman class, they read, you know, some 600-700 pages per week in some of these courses. And that's way too much, but I forced them to do it so that, you know, they know how to do this, and they after a while they were like, yeah, I can do this. So helping them recognize they can actually master something difficult is really helpful.
Right. Okay, Brandon, another question for you, and of course, Tom and Angela, you guys can also chime in. You recently wrote a little piece for us at the IHE website on how people of faith have, you know, done, you know, sort of handled the pandemic differently than people who lack faith. This question asks, how did faith and prayer at Catholic University of Dallas, play a role in helping your university communities in addressing the metaphysical questions that became top of the mind during COVID? So yeah, I mean, this is actually open also for you, Tom, and Angela as well. But Brandon, we'll just start with you. Maybe you could explain a little bit the sort of what you wrote about for us at the, you know, through our website, and then try to connect this to how faith perhaps helps think about these deep questions that arise in a time of pandemic.
Yeah, sure.
I know it's a big subject. Yeah.
The work I've done briefly is just to look at how congregations, you know, different kinds of faith communities, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, have been affected by the pandemic, and it was focused on mental health in particular, and so various measurements of mental health scales and so on. And we find that those who are more religious, so those who are praying more, who for whom faith is more important, are better off. They report better levels of well-being and life satisfaction, and lower levels of depression and anxiety and so on. But of course, there's the attendance has dropped because a lot of faith communities have closed, and that has had a negative impact. And it also seems to have impacted their sense of isolation. So a lot of people certainly feeling isolated. And I think the one sort of surprising finding, I guess, for us was that a lot of members of faith communities are not really close to each other. They don't build deep friendships. Even those who are really active in their faith communities rarely share their problems with one another. So I think there might be, parallel to the university, that I think, that faith is a resource, is a source of solace and a source of resilience for a lot of students. We've had students who've really struggled with, family members, close family members dying, with their friends, suffering with roommates and so on, suffering with the consequence of COVID. And so faith, I know from just, again, really anecdotal reports from students of how important it is. But I think that the breakdown of community, the inability to form friendships or to sustain those friendships during the pandemic, I think will have pretty severe effects on mental health and well-being.
Tom or Angela on that, or because I can move on. I got other questions here too. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Totally practical question. Okay, exactly the kind of question that we would anticipate given what we all say. And again, we're all academics. We share this view. So if universities are for learning for its own sake, right, for the pursuit of truth, as we discussed, for its own sake, are they worth the money? Are they worth the money? Yeah, Angela, you want to take us? Thank you, Angela. Great.
I think the first thing that I would say is I think that the cost of a university education right now is shameful. I think it's appalling. I mean, when my dad put himself through college, paid for it, that was possible when he was young. My family didn't have any money. I got to go to college because I got a scholarship. I couldn't. I mean, I could have maybe gone to a public university or a public school and taken out loans. I do think that college is appallingly expensive, and I think we should think about why that is and what could be done about it. I do think that it is incredibly valuable. My dad worked to put himself through college, and then came home from Vietnam to a depressed economy and never ever got a job that made use of his college education. And yet he never regretted it. And the things he taught me, the person that he was clearly formed by that education. And it made an impact on me to this day. I no longer have my dad, but I have everything he taught me. And it's incredibly valuable, incredibly valuable. But precisely because it's so valuable, we shouldn't make people go bankrupt trying to get one. So that's not much of an answer.
No, it's a beautiful answer, Angela. It really is. It to me, again, points to the communal good here, right? We're all describing a communal good. And what you're saying is that this is such a great good that as a community, we should be bearing the costs to make it a good available to more members of our community, right? So that they don't have to, like you said, go bankrupt or be excluded from this good that can change their lives, even if they, like your father, they never put the darn degree to use, Tom or Brandon, any comments on its value? Tom, perhaps first, then Brandon.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important that you look at that universities look carefully at the percentage of students who graduate with debt for loans, and particularly with how much that is, and that they get into how much it is for certain populations of the student body and whether it's bearable or endurable or affordable for them. And if it isn't, to find ways to remedy that. And targeted, high-powered scholarship fundraising focus can often be an assistance there. I mean, the tuition is typically discounted at a pretty high rate. But still, the starting point is so high that many students do graduate with debt. And I think it's important that schools look at that. I think it's also on the practical side of things. You know, Angela was talking about how different it was back in the old days when her dad and probably me were going to school. You know, there wasn't all that much pressure. We thought we'd find a job, you know, we'd do something, and we thought we'd have opportunities. Now, that wasn't as true for people who didn't grow up in communities like I did, but it was more generally true, I think. So there wasn't as much pressure to go to college. There wasn't as much pressure for the cost of it. And you thought you were going to get something. You know, increasingly, we have students who come to college with little or no work experience at all. I mean, these surveys, Brookings did a survey last year that showed an almost near disappearance of high school students in the workforce, partly because they can't, and in college students, they can't make enough money working summers to make a dent on college debt. And they're also involved 24 hours a day and 12 months a year in club sports, AP training. I mean, it's not that they're slackers. It's just that they're involved in all sorts of things that their parents and their teachers and their coaches govern. So they don't develop the kind of resilience you do from independent activities. But they also simply haven't tried out what it means to be in the workforce, to work with customers, to work with colleagues, to work with bosses. I have a friend in business who says the best thing you can do as a high school student is to work retail, because you have those experiences that can help you once you sort of just living experiences and how to read people. And I think we have to be aware in colleges that we might not like the fact that we have this additional responsibility, but we've got to encourage our students through internships and other things to get those kinds of experiences, or their situation will be worse than the older generation's experience we're talking about, not just because it's more costly, but because they won't have had the basic practical experiences that people generations ago did just from growing up. And that's an additional burden on colleges. We might not like that we have it, but I think we have to be aware of it if we're going to graduate students who are prepared to go into the world and not flounder over debt and not having skills at all.
Yeah, I think skills are absolutely crucial. I mean, one of my mentors, my undergrad business school, I mean, he emphasized two things. You need rare and valuable skills. So you have to have a contribution mindset where you don't see yourself as just a consumer saying, I'm going to regurgitate what you want to hear in this class, and you give me an A, and then I'm going to take this piece of paper and go to a workplace and say, here's my degree, give me a damn job, right? That's not the kind of person you want to be, and companies don't want people like that. You need to have skills, you need to contribute, but you also, he said, need to be a deep generalist. You need to be the kind of person who knows how to learn. You have to love learning. You have to have a relentless, ability to keep learning. And so the learning for its own sake and that kind of capacity is crucial, but also being oriented towards making a contribution and developing specific skills that are rare and valuable, that we shouldn't undermine that. I mean, if you're independently wealthy, maybe, but otherwise, we definitely don't want to create a situation where our students are floundering in debt.
I also think maybe we make college, we make it too important in the wrong kinds of ways. So why do kids never have summer jobs? Well, because, they're already in their freshman year of high school trying to get internships and do volunteer work and get their Eagle Scout thing. Why? Not because it's important and they want to, but because they have to make that resume so they get into the right college, so that they can get into the right law school, so that they can get the right job, right? It's all this kind of, and people didn't used to act like that, we make college is kind of all important thing, as if it's supposed to provide all of these things if you can only get there, and you miss out on life on the way. And it just can't. When you think that college is going to provide all of those things, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. It's just not going to.
Look, fantastic, guys. We're going to stop there. So much stuff and so much stuff still to discuss, right? I mean, this was really just a beautiful conversation, and I'm deeply indebted to the three of you for giving us your time and your insights today. So again, thank you. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. Again, there are a lot of open questions. Plenty more questions from you that we just were not able to get to. But if you like this, please go to our YouTube channel, go to ihe.catholic.edu. You can find, or you will be able to find a recording of this and of the prior session. Where our next session is April 14th at 2 p.m., also a Zoom webinar, and we'll be joined by two more IHE Fellows, Margarita Mooney of Princeton University and Michael Gorman, a colleague of ours here at Catholic University in the School of Philosophy. And there may be a special guest, we're still working on that. And then also Friday, we're having the first of a partnership that we're doing with Baylor University. We're having a wonderful event hosted by David Corey. It's called Evaluating Liberalism, and the guests for that will be Sam Goldman, Kristen Dede Johnson, and William Kavanaugh. Again, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. Have a good evening, everybody, and thanks to my guests.